morning, and welcome to First Edition, the online ministry of First Community Church. My name is Glenn Miles. I'm the senior minister here in this amazing and awesome congregation, and we're thrilled that you've joined us on this day for worship. We want you to know that no matter who you are, where you're from, what you believe or what you don't believe, you are welcomed and accepted here. Right now, there's a QR code up on the screen. Take a moment, would you please, to capture that QR code with the camera option on your phone. You can register your attendance after you click on the link, put in a prayer concern if you have one, and even give for the offering if you choose to do so. Today, I'm in the middle of my sermon series, Somehow Love Will Find a Way. This is part 2, and it's based on a letter to the church in Thessalonica from the Apostle Paul and his friends Silvanus and Timothy. It's the oldest document found in the New Testament, and it gives us 3 huge clues about what mattered most to the earliest days of the church. You might not be surprised to hear that those 3 gifts are faith, hope, and love. That's something Paul wrote to the church in Corinth as well a few years later. I'm looking forward to sharing this sermon with you. Now, sit back and enjoy this hour of worship, especially as you hear from our children's anthem right now.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Let us be known, let us be known by the way we love. Let us be known, let us be known by the way we love. Let us be known, let us be known by the way we love. Let us be known, let us be known by the way we love. Love, love, the greatest commandment is love. Love, love, the greatest commandment is love. Love, love, the greatest commandment is love.
The oldest document in the New Testament is a love letter. It's the one we just heard from the Apostle Paul, sent to the church in northern Greece, in the city of Thessalonica, a thriving seaport there, still thriving even to this day. It's a love letter expressing their great love and thanksgiving and praise for the congregation they helped to found a couple of years before. And you can feel the love that flows back to Paul and his companions, Silvanus and Timothy. It's a love letter. In fact, Beverly Roberts Gaventa, who I heard this from first, she's a fine New Testament scholar. She suggests that we read it like a love letter, that we pore over every word, parse every phrase, try to understand what's between the lines, what other messages might be being sent, where is it written from, and why, and what's their ultimate desire in their message, to read it like a love letter. Have you ever received a love letter? You can raise your hand, don't be shy. I know in the days of texts and email and messages on Facebook and all of that, we probably aren't taking the time to write love letters as much as we used to. But I got one on my birthday last year, back in November. It's a note expressing deep love for me. I keep it in my wallet at all times so that I can pull it out in case I need to just be reminded again. I've probably read it 117 times at least so far. Oh, by the way, it's from my wife, Julie, in case you're curious. I can pull it out after a terrible sermon and read it and know that there's somebody who still loves me, even if the preaching moment was less than stellar. I can pull it out and read it when I fail on a project or don't meet a deadline, or you can understand. That's how we're invited to read this letter from Paul and his companions to the church in Thessalonica as a love letter expressing deep passion and joy for them. And what this also tells us, as the oldest document in the New Testament, before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's Gospels were written and shared, this oldest document tells us what the driving force was in the church. It helps us see what the fuel was that kept their fire burning. Did you hear it? It's the labor of love. To be a Christian in the first 30, 40, 50, 100 years even was a very difficult thing. There was persecution, maybe not as intense as we used to believe, but still there was persecution. And at best, there was oftentimes, families were torn apart. People lost their jobs because they joined the church. People were looked down upon. They were considered as unpatriotic. I mean, think about this. Why would you have a religion that worships a Palestinian man who was crucified? People thought that was like a cult or some other kind of nonsense. They couldn't believe it. And they thought it was unpatriotic because in Paul's day, there was something called the emperor cult. You were called on to worship the emperor. It was kind of a scary thought back then. It's kind of a scary thought even today, I think. I'm concerned about that. But they were thought to be unpatriotic. They were thought to be atheists because they didn't consider any of the other religions as valid or considered. They were really considered that way. So what was it? What was it that kept the church moving? What kept the church growing? What fueled the fire was the way they loved one another. And you can just feel the love coming off the page here as Paul describes his deep love for them and their deep love for Paul and his companions, and the way the church's love has sustained them through some difficult times. Well, this sermon series, as you know, is inspired by Anne Lamott's book, her latest book, Somehow, Thoughts on Love. She asks early in the book, what is it, this thing that we're talking about? What is it? What is love? Well, she decided to take that question and go down the street from her house and ask a 6-year-old friend of hers, what is love? And he said, oh, it's just stuff. That's a pretty good answer. I like that a lot. But then the next line, she says, I like to believe that love moves in my life with the gracefulness of a ballerina. But in reality, love comes to my life in plops and flops, in falls and tiptoes. Frankly, I'm glad that's the way love works in this world. If it only came when our lives were smooth and beautiful like that of a lovely ballerina, then love would never come, at least not to me, and perhaps not to most of us, if not all of us. Which causes me to worry a little bit about those weddings that sometimes are just unbelievably perfect. Have you been to a perfect wedding before? I've done hundreds. Most of them are not perfect. There's been about a dozen where everything just worked. All the people in the wedding party are gorgeous, beautiful, handsome. The families are all behaving well and getting along. The music is gorgeous. This church is decorated tastefully and appropriately. The 3-year-old ring bearer comes all the way down the aisle and doesn't run out screaming like so many of them done in so many other weddings I've officiated and led. But I always worry, if that was so perfect, what about the next day? Or what about a couple of weeks later when they're coming back from the honeymoon? Or a couple months later when some unexpected thing happens out of the blue, a crisis or a challenge, a failure? What happens? I kind of worry about those folks. My wedding, Julie's and my wedding, was a great preparation for the reality of life. The first thing that happened was I failed to try on my tux on Thursday. All my groomsmen, they tried on their tuxes, but I didn't think I needed to. And when I put them on, my pants were about 2 inches too short. And not only that, they're about 2 inches too small in the waist. Now, back then, we were only 20 years old when we got married. I was 6'2", and weighed 170 pounds. I was pretty skinny. It wasn't my fault that the pants were too tight. They sent the wrong pants, obviously. It looked like I was sprayed into them. Then, about an hour before the wedding, when we're supposed to have photos taken, we find out that our photographer, a good friend of my dad's, somebody not much older than Julie and me, a guy who'd been an amateur photographer and now is doing it as a business, also was a weightlifter. Kind of an Arnold Schwarzenegger looking guy, just a big buff guy who could lift a tremendous amount of weight. Well, 2 days before, he'd been bench pressing when he benched too much and he burst the blood vessels in his eyes. It was a temporary condition, but he was legally blind at our wedding. We have some wonderful pictures of my ear. Then the wedding began, and we weren't going to have classical music. We weren't going to do anything traditional. This was 1979. We were hip and cool, and we were together, and we decided we're going to do all pop music. Our favorite songs were going to be sung in the ceremony, not any of that other traditional kind of stuff. And so Julie walked in with her father. She looked beautiful, of course. And then one of our soloists sang the love theme from A Star Is Born. Not the current one, obviously, but which one? The Barbra Streisand one. Do you remember how it goes? Love soft as an easy chair. Love fresh as the morning air. Love ageless and evergreen. And it gets worse from there. But she came in, she was beautiful, of course, came and stood by me. And then my father, who's the pastor of that church, led the ceremony for us. We got married at First Christian Church in San Francisco. And the ceremony went fine. We were nearing the end until it came time for communion. My dad turned around, the communion table was behind him in that church, and there was no bread. There was no wine. Somebody, probably my dad, he never confessed it, forgot to put the bread and the wine out. And so he whispers to Julie and me, there's no communion. Well, we weren't too worried about that. Fine, we'll just move along. But the problem was my mom was going to sing a solo as we're receiving communion. So her signal to leave her chair there to come up on the chancel and stand with the pianist was when my dad started serving the bread and the wine. So my dad starts to panic. I can still see the sweat literally popping off of his face as he's nervous and can't figure out what to do. So he leans around me and he sees my mom right there in the front row and he says in a stage whisper, Jan. But she's not looking at him or listening for him because her cue really is the pianist who has said, I'll move to the piano first, I'll play the introduction, why don't you come up kind of dramatically up onto the stage and sing the solo. So she's watching the pianist, not my dad, and he's going, Jan. And finally he just goes, Jan, there's no communion. The whole place bursts out laughing. My mom kind of panics, but then she runs up on the chancel, the pianist begins the introduction and she sings her solo. Do you know what it was? We've only just begun. It was the perfect preparation for our wedding. Truly, because our married life has been filled with beautiful, wonderful, graceful moments like the dancing of a ballerina, but more often than not, there's been trumps and plops, falls and failures, and most of those were me. But every time, love made its way in. Love found its way to us and gave us hope for the next day, no matter how much we'd fallen. Even when we were seriously on our way to getting a divorce, love, to borrow Anne Lamott's word, tiptoed back in. And it was more than enough. You see, love is a choice. Love, as the group Boston sang back in the 70s, is more than a feeling. Love is an action, it's a verb, it's a choice, it's a decision to give yourself over to someone in the name of love, to make it as real as possible. And Anne Lamott tells a story about a time she was going through not a horrible crisis, but enough of a crisis to where she was in disarray and confused and wasn't quite sure what to do next. And she was talking to some friends, and her brother overheard what was going on. And her brother, whom she loves, said, can we get together and talk? I'd love to talk with you about this issue you're facing. And she said no, and here's why. Her brother is an extremely conservative evangelical Christian, and Anne is an extremely liberal, progressive Christian who would fit in well in a congregation like this. And although she loves her brother deeply and she knows that he loves her as well, sometimes their conversations devolve down into Christian cliches and platitudes like, God only gives us what we can handle, which, by the way, is not in the Bible. And she's like, but I don't really need a conversation. What I need from my brother is for somebody to sit next to me. I want you to sit next to me on the couch. I'm gonna get a big bucket of popcorn, and I want to binge watch old Bob Newhart television shows. Some of you remember Bob Newhart back in the day, pretty funny guy. That's all I need. And you know what her brother said? Let's watch some TV and get some popcorn. That's what love looks like. That's how love operates. Love is a willingness to sit with someone, not with cheap advice, not with a sort of an air above, let me help you with your problem here, but to simply be present with them, to come with few words, and a willingness to practice what we call the ministry of presence, to be there, even as just to create some space between the crisis that has created some issues, has created an issue in your life. Do you know that the redwood forest, the roots of those trees do not go down 10, 12, 15 feet into the soil. They're very, very shallow. But despite their shallowness, they're quite strong because they're interconnected. If you go into a redwood forest, you'll find that the tree's roots are interconnected. They provide strength to all the other trees. If there's a windstorm, a thunderstorm, a terrific blast of wind, those trees hold on to each other so they can remain standing in the face of the storm. According to the research, if one tree is ill or sick, other trees will send nutrients to the ill one so that it might recover. Love is a system of roots that connects us one to the other. Love is a choice. It's more than a feeling. It's an action, a willingness to be there and to be present in someone else's time of need. You know, there's an interesting phrase in the text that Joan read for us a few moments ago. It's the idea that we are to be imitators of Paul and his companions. Now that seems like actually an awkward or problematic kind of thing. I would never stand here in front of you as your pastor and say, now imitate me and be like me as you practice your Christian faith. I wouldn't say that, and I don't know very many pastors who would. You might not want to go to that church if they're talking like that. However, 2,000 years ago, that was sort of a normal practice by a master teacher and his students. They would be invited to imitate, mimic the teacher in whatever the lesson was they were giving. And it works kind of like this. Andy Blosser is the fine director of our music ministry. I've sat in on some of their rehearsals, and I love watching the way Andy helps the choir hear the notes, to shape the words, to sing together as one voice. And oftentimes he might even sing the note or clap out the time for them. They're to imitate Andy, not because Andy is all above everything, but because he's a marvelous teacher. What was true in antiquity can be true for us here as well, of course. But then there's a second part of that phrase where they're invited to imitate us as we imitate the Lord. Implied in that statement is the crucified Lord, as we imitate Jesus the Christ, the one who opened his arms wide to the world in the name of love, the one who went to the edges and to the margins and welcomed those people to be a part of receiving God's love, the one who went to the ones who'd been stepped on and stepped over, inviting them to be a part of the community of faith, to let them know that they've not been forgotten, they've not been left behind, that God knows their name, God numbers the hair on their head, which is easier for God on some of us than others. They're invited by this crucified one who gave himself, so much so that he threatened the politicians of the day and they had him executed. And yet love defeated death. And Paul says, this is the one. It's this one who we imitate. You know, that's kind of a hard thing to measure. Have you noticed that? You can't always count love, how much love is being given by someone. Healthy churches, and we're a healthy churches like us, we pay attention to the number of people who are members of the church. We pay attention to the income and the expenses, and we carefully monitor both so that we don't spend more than we have. We count the square footage in all of our space, that we can prepare our budgets to manage our buildings and all that sort of space. We can count those things. Those are healthy sorts of things to count. But how do you measure love? Paul's saying to the church in Thessalonica, he's saying to the church in Columbus, this is the most important thing in the church. It's not easy to measure. It's not easy to see always. Sometimes it functions like a system of roots just beneath the surface, reaching out quietly with a phone call, a handshake, a kind word. It's not always easy to see or measure, but it is what matters more than anything else. And here's the risk in that. Have you ever had your heart broken when you've given your love to someone? On this day, we might ask the mothers, we might ask the fathers, the parents in the room, have you ever had your own heart broken when your child spoke mean, angry words to you? Maybe even called you an ugly name. Was your heart broken in that moment? Has your heart ever been broken when you realized that maybe you said something to the child that broke their heart as well? And it's almost too much pain to bear. Have you ever given your heart overwhelmingly, almost uncontrollably to someone you're deeply, madly, wonderfully in love with, only to have them say, but it's not the same for me? Has your heart been broken? There is good news. As the old rabbis say, when your heart is broken, it may now be ready to receive all of God's love. All of the love that God wants to give you. You know, my favorite verse in the Bible is 1 John 4, 7, and 8. If you go right outside, right here where the Burkhart cross is, in this little niche in the wall, just on the outside, opposite side of the wall there, these words are etched. Beloved, let us love one another. That's from 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. Those who love know God. Those who do not love do not know God, for God is love. It's that simple and that difficult. But notice, it doesn't say, if you have this theological view, then you're in. If you have this theological view, if you worship in this way, if you sing these songs, do that. No, 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 no. If you love, you know God. If you don't love, you do not know God, for God is love. It's my favorite word in the Bible. It's the very first verses I memorized in the 3rd grade in the old King James Version. I love Anne Lamott's translation of it. She's not a trained theologian, but she's got a great theological mind. She translates that same verse as this: reach out and don't be a jerk. I got to tell you, we ought to give her an honorary doctorate just for that simple, clear understanding. Reach out and don't be a jerk. Give your heart away to the world in the name of love. What is love? The Apostle Paul made it very clear. Love is patient and kind, is not arrogant, boastful, or rude. Love believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. This love, what did Paul write? What did he say to the church in Corinth? This love never ends. Do we have the courage? Do we have the hope? Do we have the faith to let that love be alive in our hearts, alive in our bodies, alive in our soul, alive in our minds, that we might transform one another and being a transformation in this church, transform the world around us? Do we have the courage to let that love come in? Is your heart broken? Maybe it's ready for God's love to fill your soul. In the name of the God of love, let it be so.